Thomas Whitman stood at the edge of his vast backyard, watching the sunset over the bay. The golden light bounced off the water and made his white mansion seem to glow. He sipped his expensive whiskey and checked his watch, a habit he had when waiting for someone. His life looked perfect from the outside. At 52, Thomas had built one of the biggest property companies in Port Haven. His face appeared in business magazines and local papers. People whispered his name at fancy parties. He had money, power, and respect, the three things he valued most. But Thomas had a secret that would shock the people who kissed up to him at charity events and golf tournaments. That secret lived above his garage in a small apartment with faded curtains and second-hand furniture. The sound of a car pulling up made Thomas turn. His assistant got out, leading a teenage girl toward the main house. The girl walked with her head down, her curly black hair hiding her face. "Zora," Thomas said, not moving to greet her. "You're late." "The bus was delayed," she answered softly. "I'm sorry." Thomas waved away his assistant and pointed to a chair across from him. "Sit." Zora Whitman was Thomas's daughter, though few people knew this truth. Her mother, Amara Johnson, had been a beautiful black woman Thomas had dated briefly, 15 years ago. When Amara died giving birth to Zora, Thomas reluctantly took the baby in, not out of love, but because of legal obligations tied to Amara's family money. "Your school called again," Thomas said, swirling his drink. "They said you've been asking questions about college applications." Zora looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. "Yes, I was thinking, I've told you before." Thomas cut her off. "We agreed you'd work in the company after high school, in the filing room, where you can be useful without being seen. But I could study business, maybe help with the company in a bigger way someday," Zora suggested, her voice getting smaller with each word. Thomas laughed, a cold sound with no humor. "This company will go to someone worthy of the Whitman name, not to someone who would make my partners and clients uncomfortable." He didn't need to explain what he meant. Zora had heard it all before, how her dark skin and curly hair didn't fit the Whitman image, how her existence was an embarrassment Thomas had been stuck with. "Go to your room," Thomas said, already turning back to the view. "Mrs. Parker left dinner for you in the kitchen." Zora walked away, her shoulders slumped. The small apartment above the garage was her prison, though it had nice enough furniture and a TV. She was allowed to go to school and nowhere else. No friends could visit. No social media. No phone except the old flip phone Thomas gave her for emergencies. What Thomas didn't know was that Zora had found papers in his home office 3 weeks ago. Papers about a trust fund her mother's parents had set up for her. Papers that said when she turned 18 she would get control of millions of dollars. Her birthday was just 2 weeks away. Across town, Elaine Corday sighed as she looked at her computer screen. As a new paralegal at Brooks & Morgan, the law firm that handled Thomas Whitman's business, she had been tasked with organizing his personal files. What she found made her stomach turn. Elaine was 35. With blonde hair she often pulled into a messy bun when working late, like tonight. She had moved to Port Haven 6 months ago, looking for a fresh start after her divorce. She needed this job and the steady paycheck it provided. On her screen was a transfer record showing money moving from an account labeled ZJ Trust into offshore accounts owned by Thomas. The transfers had been happening monthly for years, small enough amounts to stay under the radar but adding up to millions. "What are you still doing here?" Elaine jumped at the voice. Her boss, Richard Brooks, stood in the doorway, his suit still perfectly pressed despite the late hour. "Just organizing the Whitman files," she said, quickly switching to a different screen. "Don't waste too much time on those," Richard said. "Thomas likes his privacy. Just do the basic sorting I asked for." After he left, Elaine went back to the suspicious transfers. She knew she should mind her own business. Getting involved in the affairs of someone as powerful as Thomas Whitman could cost her everything. But something felt very wrong. Who was ZJ? And why was Thomas taking their money? The next morning, Thomas sat in his home office reviewing property plans. His new hotel project would make him even richer if he could keep the investors happy. He needed the money from Zora's trust to cover some recent losses he couldn't let anyone know about. Once she turned 18, the trust would be hers unless something happened to her. His phone rang. It was Richard Brooks. "Someone's been looking at the trust files," Richard said without greeting. "The new paralegal. I caught her last night." Thomas gripped his phone tighter. "Did she see anything important?" "I'm not sure, but maybe we should move up our timeline." Thomas looked out his window at the garage apartment where Zora was studying. "Yes," he said slowly. "I think we should. Tonight." Unknown to both men, Elaine had made copies of the most concerning documents. She didn't know what to do with them yet, but her gut told her someone might be in danger. She just didn't know who ZJ was or how to find them. As evening fell, Zora finished her homework and stared out her window at the main house. Her father, though he never let her call him that, had been acting strange lately. Watching her, more closely, asking about her plans. It made her nervous. The trust fund papers were hidden under her mattress. 2 more weeks, she kept telling herself. 2 more weeks and she could leave this place forever. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Meet me at the car in 10 minutes. We need to talk about your future." Zora's heart raced. Did he know she had found the papers? Was he finally going to acknowledge her as his daughter? Or was something else happening? She grabbed her jacket and the copy of the trust document she'd made just in case. Whatever happened tonight, she had a feeling nothing would be the same afterward. What she didn't know was that Thomas had already decided her fate, and it involved the old bridge on the east side of town, where the water below was deep and the current strong. And neither of them knew that Meredith Wilson, a local teacher, would be driving home across that same bridge later that night, just in time to witness something that would change all their lives forever. Rain pounded against the windshield as Meredith Wilson drove across Eastwood Bridge. Her wipers fought against the downpour, and she leaned forward, straining to see through the darkness. It was nearly midnight, and she was exhausted after grading papers at the high school where she taught history. The headlights of her old Honda cut through the rain, briefly illuminating the metal railings of the bridge. That's when she saw them. 2 figures near the edge. One tall and broad-shouldered, the other smaller, seeming to struggle against the first. Meredith slowed her car, squinting through the rain. Something was wrong. The taller figure, a man in what looked like an expensive coat, had grabbed the smaller person by the arm. Even through the storm, she could hear shouting. "No one will ever believe you," the man yelled, his voice barely audible over the rain. Meredith pulled over and fumbled for her phone. As she dialed 911, her eyes never left the scene unfolding 30 yards away. The smaller figure, a teenage girl with dark, curly hair, was pushing against the man, trying to break free. Papers were scattered around them, some blowing into the river below. 911, what's your emergency? "I'm on Eastwood Bridge," Meredith said quickly. "There's a man attacking a young girl. I think he's trying to—" Her words cut off as she watched in horror. The man had lifted the struggling girl and was forcing her toward the railing. Meredith dropped her phone and jumped out of her car, the rain immediately soaking through her clothes. "Hey!" she shouted, running toward them. "Stop!" The man turned, and in the dim light from the bridge lamps, Meredith caught a glimpse of his face. Handsome, clean-shaven, with eyes widened in surprise at being witnessed. She recognized him from somewhere but couldn't place him in. That moment of panic. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The man gave one final push and the girl went over the railing with a terrified scream. Without hesitating, the man ran to a black luxury car parked further down the bridge. Meredith raced to the spot where the girl had fallen, looking over the edge. The dark water churned 20 feet below, but in a stroke of luck, the girl had landed on a small muddy bank rather than in the deep water. She lay motionless, the rain washing over her still form. "I'm coming!" Meredith shouted, though she wasn't sure if the girl could hear her. As the black car sped away, Meredith managed to catch part of the license plate. UH1. She repeated it to herself as she searched for a way down to the riverbank. Finding a steep path near the bridge's end, she half climbed, half slid down the muddy slope, her heart pounding with fear and adrenaline. When she reached the girl, she found her breathing but unconscious, a gash on her forehead bleeding steadily. "It's going to be okay," Meredith whispered, though she wasn't sure if that was true. She took off her jacket and placed it over the girl to keep her warm. Police sirens wailed in the distance as Meredith tried to make the injured girl comfortable without moving her too much. The girl's eyes fluttered open briefly. "He found the papers," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "My inheritance, the trust." "Who did this to you?" Meredith asked gently. "My father," the girl whispered before losing consciousness again. When the police and ambulance arrived, they struggled to reach the riverbank. The paramedics carefully moved the girl onto a stretcher and carried her up the steep slope with Meredith following close behind. "Did you see what happened?" an officer asked once they reached the road. "A man threw her over the bridge," Meredith said, shivering in the rain. "I got part of his license plate, WH1. He was tall, well-dressed. They were arguing about papers." The officer's expression changed subtly. "You're sure that's what you saw? Could she have jumped?" Meredith frowned. "No, absolutely not. He forced her over. She was fighting him." Another officer approached. "The girl had ID. Her name is Zora Whitman." "Whitman?" the first officer said, exchanging a look with his colleague. "As in Thomas Whitman?" Meredith's stomach dropped as she finally placed the face she'd seen. Thomas Whitman was one of the most powerful men in Port Haven, a major donor to the police department's charity fund. His picture was often in the local paper. "I'm going to the hospital with her," Meredith insisted, moving toward the ambulance. "We'll need your statement, Ms. Wilson." "Meredith Wilson. I teach at Port Haven High." She climbed into the ambulance beside Zora's stretcher. "I'll give my statement after I know she's safe." At Port Haven Memorial Hospital, doctors rushed Zora into emergency surgery. Meredith sat in the waiting room, still in her wet clothes, giving her statement to a detective named James Haywood, a serious man with kind eyes who listened carefully to her account. "This is a serious accusation against a prominent citizen," Detective Haywood said after she finished. "We'll need to investigate thoroughly." "She said he was her father," Meredith told him, right before she passed out again. Haywood looked surprised. "Thomas Whitman doesn't have any children." "Well, she had his last name on her ID and she said her father pushed her." Meredith wrapped her arms around herself. "Why would the police at the scene seem so hesitant when I mentioned Whitman's name?" Haywood sighed. "Mr. Whitman has connections throughout the city. But I assure you, I'll follow this investigation wherever it leads." 3 hours later, a surgeon approached them. "She's stable, but with serious injuries. Broken ribs, a fractured arm, concussion, and internal bleeding we've managed to control. She's in a medically induced coma to help her heal." "Will she recover?" Meredith asked. "We hope so, but the next 48 hours are critical." Meredith couldn't explain why she felt so protective of this girl she'd never met before tonight. Perhaps it was the vulnerability in her face, or the shocking betrayal of a father trying to kill his own daughter. Whatever the reason, she knew she couldn't walk away. "I'd like to stay," she told Haywood, "at least until she wakes up." As dawn broke, Meredith dozed in an uncomfortable chair beside Zora's hospital bed. The steady beeping of machines kept her half awake. A nurse had brought her dry scrubs to change into and coffee that had long since gone cold. She was startled fully awake by a commotion in the hallway. "I demand to see her immediately," a man's voice boomed. "I'm her father," Meredith recognized, the voice from the bridge. Her heart began to race as she stepped into the hallway to see Thomas Whitman arguing with hospital staff. He was immaculately dressed in a suit that probably cost more than her monthly salary, not a hint of the previous night's violence in his appearance. His eyes met hers, a flash of recognition and then alarm crossing his face before he smoothed his expression. "Who are you?" he demanded. Before Meredith could answer, Detective Haywood stepped between them. "Mr. Whitman, I'm Detective James Haywood. We need to ask you some questions about your daughter's injuries." "My poor Zora tried to take her own life," Thomas said, his voice suddenly dripping with concern. "She's been troubled for years. I've tried everything to help her." Meredith couldn't believe what she was hearing. That's not what happened. I saw you. Haywood touched her arm lightly, cutting her off. Mr. Whitman, where were you last night between 11 p.m. and midnight? At home, of course. My housekeeper can confirm it. His cold eyes fixed on Meredith. I don't know what this woman thinks she saw, but Zora has been depressed. She left a note. There was no note, Meredith protested. Thomas pulled out his phone, showing a photo of a handwritten letter. I found this in her room this morning when I discovered she was missing. Haywood studied the image. We'll need the original for handwriting analysis. Of course, Thomas said smoothly. Anything to help my daughter. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to see her. As he brushed past Meredith, he whispered so only she could hear. Be careful what you say, teacher. You have no idea who you're dealing with. The threat sent chills down her spine, but it also hardened her resolve. This man had tried to kill his daughter and was now attempting to cover it up, and somehow he already knew she was a teacher, which meant he'd been checking up on her. Haywood pulled her aside. Ms. Wilson, I believe what you saw, but we need to be careful. Whitman has half the city in his pocket. What about the license plate I gave you? It matches one of his cars, but without more evidence. What about Zora? When she wakes up, if she wakes up, Haywood corrected gently. And if she does, will she testify against her father? Many abuse victims don't. Meredith looked through. The door at the unconscious girl, tubes and wires connecting her to machines keeping her alive. She mentioned papers before she passed out. Something about an inheritance and a trust. Haywood nodded thoughtfully. That might give us a motive. I'll look into it. He handed her his card. Be careful, Ms. Wilson, and call me if you remember anything else. As Meredith watched Thomas sit beside his daughter's bed, playing the role of concerned father, she knew this was far from over. Something terrible was happening in the Whitman family, and somehow, she had become part of it. What she didn't know was that across town, a young paralegal named Elaine Corday was discovering financial records that would blow this case wide open, if she lived long enough to share them. Detective James Haywood sat at his cluttered desk, staring at the photos. From Eastwood Bridge, 3 days had passed since Zora Whitman had been found barely alive on the riverbank, and the case was already hitting walls. Thomas Whitman had provided a seemingly airtight alibi, supported by his housekeeper and private security team. The suicide note found in Zora's room looked genuine, though Haywood was still waiting on handwriting analysis. But something didn't add up. Meredith Wilson had no reason to lie about what she saw that night on the bridge. Her description was too detailed, too consistent in repeated tellings to be a mistake. His phone rang, displaying the police chief's number. Haywood sighed before answering. Haywood, I need you in my office. Now. The chief hung up without waiting for a response. 5 minutes later, Haywood stood across from Chief Robert Palmer, a man whose career had flourished alongside Thomas Whitman's rise in Port Haven. I'm reassigning the Whitman girl's case, Palmer said without preamble. Why? We're just getting started with the investigation. Palmer leaned back in his chair. Thomas Whitman called me personally this morning. He's concerned about how this investigation is affecting his daughter's recovery. The doctors say the stress could complicate things. With all due respect, sir, we have a witness who saw him push his daughter off that bridge. You have an exhausted teacher who was driving in a storm at midnight and thinks she saw something, Palmer countered. Meanwhile, we have a suicide note and a history of mental health issues the girl's therapist has confirmed. Haywood frowned. What therapist? This is the first I'm hearing of one. Palmer tossed a file across the desk. Dr. Reynolds has treated Zora for depression for the past 2 years. His records were just delivered this morning. Haywood flipped through the file. Everything looked legitimate, but something felt off. I'd like to speak with Dr. Reynolds directly. He's out of the country at a conference, Palmer said too quickly. Look, James, I know you want to do right by this girl, but sometimes the simple answer is the correct one. She tried to kill herself, and her wealthy father is embarrassed and trying to protect her privacy. And the witness. Ms. Wilson is certain about what she saw. People see what they expect to see. A single woman probably reads too many true crime novels. Palmer stood up. The case is being transferred to Detective Collins. You've got that convenience store robbery to focus on. Haywood knew arguing would be pointless. Palmer and Whitman played golf together every Sunday, but he wasn't going to let this go. Across town, Elaine Corday was having problems of her own. When she arrived at work that morning, her computer access had been restricted, and Richard Brooks had personally asked her to focus on other clients, away from the Whitman files. "Is something wrong?" she had asked. "Not at all," Brooks had replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We're just reorganizing some accounts. Thomas Whitman prefers his personal matters to be handled directly by partners." Elaine wasn't convinced. The records she'd found showed years of systematic theft. Thomas Whitman had been draining a trust fund set up for someone with the initials ZJ, transferring small amounts regularly to offshore accounts. Based on her calculations, he had stolen nearly $3 million. During her lunch break, Elaine walked to a coffee shop 2 blocks from her office and opened her personal laptop. Before losing access, she had emailed herself copies of the most damning documents. As she reviewed them, she noticed something she had missed before. The trust would fully mature when ZJ turned 18, which according to the paperwork would happen in less than 2 weeks. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Daughter of prominent businessman Thomas Whitman in critical condition after suicide attempt. Elaine clicked on the article and felt her blood run cold. The girl's name was Zora. ZJ could stand for Zora Johnson, perhaps her name before Whitman. The article mentioned she was 17 years old. It couldn't be a coincidence. The timing was too perfect. Just before Zora would gain control of her trust fund, she supposedly attempts suicide? After Elaine had discovered the missing money, she needed to tell someone, but who? The police might be in Whitman's pocket. As she contemplated her next move, a woman sat down at her table without asking. "Elaine Corday?" the woman asked quietly. "My name is Meredith Wilson. I need to talk to you about Thomas Whitman and his daughter." Elaine stared at her. "How did you find me?" "Detective Haywood suggested I might want to speak with the new paralegal at Brooks and Morgan," Meredith explained. "He said you were asking questions about Whitman's finances." "And he just gave you my name?" Elaine asked suspiciously. "No, but he mentioned your firm was handling Whitman's affairs. I called pretending to be from another law office and asked for the new paralegals. Name?" Meredith looked around nervously. "We shouldn't talk here. I think I'm being followed." That got Elaine's attention. "There's a library 3 blocks from here. We can talk there." 20 minutes later, they sat in a quiet corner of the Port Haven public library. Meredith explained what she had witnessed on the bridge while Elaine shared her discoveries about the trust fund. "So he's been stealing from his own daughter," Meredith said, connecting the dots. "And when she turned 18 and could access the account, he tried to kill her before she found out," Elaine finished. "But you said she mentioned papers and a trust on the riverbank. She must have discovered what he was doing." "We need to go to the police with this," Meredith insisted. "The chief is Whitman's golfing buddy," Elaine pointed out, "and my boss suddenly revoked my access to all Whitman-related files this morning. Someone tipped them off that I was looking." "Detective Haywood believes me, but he's been taken off the case." Meredith ran a hand through her hair. "Whitman is already spinning the story, claiming Zora has mental health issues." "We need more evidence," Elaine said, "and we need to make sure Zora is protected until she wakes up." "If she wakes up," Meredith corrected grimly. "The doctors say she's stable but still in a coma. Whitman has private security outside her hospital room. No one gets in without his approval." As they talked, neither woman noticed the man sitting several tables away, pretending to read a newspaper while listening to their conversation. That evening, Haywood sat in his car outside the hospital, watching the main entrance. Officially, he was off the Whitman case, but that didn't mean he couldn't do some investigating on his own time. He had spent the afternoon looking into Dr. Reynolds, Zora's supposed therapist. The man existed, but his office claimed Zora Whitman had never been a patient. Someone was creating a false narrative, and Haywood intended to find out why. His phone rang. Meredith Wilson. Detective? I met with the paralegal, Elaine Corday. She found financial records showing Whitman has been stealing millions from Zora's trust fund. The trust matures when she turns 18, which is in less than 2 weeks. That would give him motive, Haywood said, his suspicions confirmed. But we need hard evidence that connects him to the bridge that night. Elaine has copies of the financial records, Meredith told him. But we're both worried. She thinks someone at her firm tipped Whitman off that she was looking into his accounts. Be careful, Haywood warned. Whitman has resources and connections. Meet me tomorrow morning at the diner on Oak Street. Bring Elaine and whatever evidence you have. After hanging up, Haywood continued his surveillance. Around 9 p.m., Thomas Whitman arrived at the hospital, nodding to the private security guard outside Zora's room before entering. He stayed for exactly 30 minutes, long enough to maintain appearances, then left. Haywood followed at a distance as Whitman's expensive car wound through the city streets, eventually arriving not at his mansion, but at the law offices of Brooks and Morgan. Interesting that he would visit his lawyers so late. Meanwhile, Elaine returned to her small apartment, unaware of the black sedan parked across the street. As she unlocked her door, she felt uneasy, like someone was watching her. Inside, something felt off, though nothing was visibly disturbed. She checked her hiding spots. The financial documents were still safely tucked inside a hollowed-out book on her shelf. Her laptop was where she'd left it. Maybe she was just being paranoid. She heated up leftovers and tried to relax, but the feeling of dread wouldn't leave her. When her phone rang with an unknown number, she almost didn't answer. Hello? Ms. Corday? This is Richard Brooks. I apologize for calling so late, but there's an urgent matter with one of our clients that needs your attention first thing tomorrow. Could you come in an hour early? Something in his tone made her nervous. Which client? A slight pause. The Robertson account. Just be at the office by 7 a.m. He hung up. Elaine frowned. There was no Robertson account that she knew of. She quickly packed an overnight bag and the financial documents, then called Meredith. I think they're on to me, she explained. My boss just called with a suspicious request. I don't think it's safe for me to stay here tonight. Come to my place, Meredith offered without hesitation. I live in the West Side Apartments, Unit 412. 15 minutes later, Elaine was in her car, watching carefully for any signs of being followed. She took 3 wrong turns intentionally, doubling back twice before heading to Meredith's. The black sedan stayed with her the entire time. Instead of going to Meredith's, she drove to the police station. If she was being followed, leading them to Meredith would put them both in danger. Detective Haywood was just leaving when Elaine pulled into the parking lot. She rushed over to him, explaining the situation. Get in my car, he said after checking the street and spotting the sedan. We'll go somewhere safe. As they drove away, Haywood made a call. Mike, it's James. I need a favor. Can you run a plate for me? Black sedan, license AGR 834. After a moment, Haywood's expression darkened. Registered to Executive Security Services, Thomas Whitman's private security firm. He knows, Elaine said, clutching her bag with the documents. What do we do now? We gather evidence and build a case that's too solid to ignore, even for the chief, Haywood said firmly. But first, we need to make sure you and Ms. Wilson are safe. At the hospital, a nurse named Lynn Patel checked Zora's vitals. The security guard had stepped away for a coffee break, giving her a moment alone with the patient. Lynn had been suspicious of the girl's injuries from the beginning. They didn't match what would typically be seen in a fall where someone jumped. The angle of the broken bones suggested she had been pushed. Plus, this wasn't the first time Zora Whitman had been in the hospital. 6 months ago, Lynn had treated her for a fall down the stairs that had left similar bruising patterns. She hadn't said anything then, believing the girl's story. Now she wasn't so sure. As she adjusted Zora's IV, the girl's eyes fluttered open briefly. You're safe, Lynn whispered quickly. Don't try to talk. Just rest. Zora's lips moved, forming a word. Help. Then the security guard returned and Lynn went back to her professional demeanor. But she had made a decision. Tomorrow she would contact Detective Haywood with her concerns. Something was very wrong with the Whitman family, and she couldn't stay silent any longer. Thomas Whitman stood at the window of his office, looking out over the Port Haven skyline he had helped build. His phone buzzed with a message from his head of security. Corday met with Wilson, now with Detective Haywood, moving to secondary plan. He set the phone down and poured himself a drink. Things were getting complicated, but he had faced worse challenges in his climb to the top. No school teacher, rookie detective, or nosy paralegal would bring him down. He had too many people in his pocket, too many favors to call in. His personal phone rang. Richard Brooks from the law firm. "Please tell me you have good news," Thomas said without greeting. "We've contained most of the situation at our end," Brooks replied. "All the original documents are secure, but according to our security team, Corday made copies before we restricted her access." Thomas swirled his drink. "And the press?" "They're running with the story we provided. Mental health issues, suicide attempt, grieving father, all of it. The Port Haven Times will have a sympathetic piece in tomorrow's edition." "Good. And the doctor?" "Dr. Reynolds has agreed to backdate records showing he treated Zora for depression. For the right price, of course." Thomas nodded to himself. "Make sure he's very well compensated. We need this to be airtight." After ending the call, Thomas reviewed his contingency plans. If worst came to worst, he could always leave the country. His offshore accounts held enough money to keep him comfortable for life. But that was a last resort. He had worked too hard, building his empire, to abandon it so easily. First, he needed to deal with the 3 people who threatened everything he had built. Across town, Meredith paced nervously in Detective Haywood's living room. The detective had brought Elaine to his house after confirming they were being followed. His partner, Officer Lisa Chen, had arrived shortly after with food and extra clothes for both women. "We can't stay here forever," Meredith said, accepting a cup of coffee from Lisa. "And what about Zora? She's still in that hospital with only Whitman's people around her." "I spoke to a nurse I trust," Haywood replied. "Lynn Patel. She's keeping an eye on Zora and will call me if anything changes." "We need to build a case that's so strong even Whitman's connections can't bury it," Lisa added. She was younger than Haywood, with a fierce intelligence that had earned her a reputation as a rising star in the department. Elaine spread the financial documents on the dining table. "These prove he's been stealing from Zora's trust for years. The trust was set up by her maternal grandparents when her mother died. According to these records, her mother's name was Amara Johnson." "That explains why Zora doesn't look like Thomas," Meredith observed. "He's never publicly acknowledged her as his daughter, has he?" "Not that I could find," Lisa confirmed. "I did some digging. There's no birth announcement, no photos of them together at events. It's like he's kept her hidden." "The trust fund paperwork shows Zora turns 18 next week," Elaine pointed out. "At that point, she gains full control of the remaining money, around $5 million, which means Thomas needed her out of the picture before then," Haywood concluded. "But financial motive isn't enough. We need to place him at the bridge that night." Meredith hesitated before speaking. "What about traffic cameras? The bridge has one at each end, doesn't it?" Lisa and Haywood exchanged looks. "The chief would never approve that request," Lisa said. "But you could access them without approval?" Elaine asked hopefully. "That would be illegal," Haywood said firmly, then paused. "But I might know someone in traffic management who owes me a favor." 3 hours later, they were looking at grainy footage from the night of the incident. Sure enough, Thomas Whitman's black Mercedes was visible entering the bridge at 11:42 p.m. and leaving at 11:56 p.m., exactly matching the time frame Meredith had reported. "This directly contradicts his alibi," Lisa said excitedly. "He claimed he was home all night." "It's still not enough," Haywood cautioned. "His lawyers will say he was out for a drive to clear his head. We need something that places him with Zora on that bridge." Meredith suddenly remembered something. "The papers. When I reached Zora on the riverbank, there were papers scattered everywhere. Some had blown into the water, but others might still be there." The crime scene team did a sweep, Lisa reminded them. Yes, but that was after Thomas already had people on site, Haywood pointed out. The first officers to respond said Whitman's security team was there before them, claiming they were looking for their boss's daughter. They could have removed evidence, Elaine realized. Or missed some, Meredith added hopefully. It was dark and raining. Papers could have blown into bushes or under rocks. It's worth checking, Haywood decided, but we'll need to be careful. If Whitman's people see us at the bridge, they'll know we're still investigating. The next morning, while Thomas Whitman gave an emotional interview to the Port Haven Times about his daughter's troubled mind and his hopes for her recovery, Lisa and Meredith searched the area below Eastwood Bridge. They wore hiking clothes and carried binoculars, pretending to be birdwatchers if anyone asked. For 2 hours they combed through mud and undergrowth, finding nothing but trash and debris from the river. This was a waste of time, Lisa said finally, wiping mud from her hands. Meredith wasn't ready to give up. Let's try further downstream. The current might have carried papers that way. 50 yards downriver, tucked under a fallen log, Meredith spotted a plastic folder, the kind used for important documents. It was dirty and water damaged, but when she carefully opened it, the contents were partially legible, trust fund documents with both Zora's and Thomas's names clearly visible. "We found it," she called to Lisa. Back at Haywood's house, they carefully dried the documents. They were financial statements showing the trust account's original balance and recent withdrawals, matching exactly what Elaine had found in the, copied records. Most importantly, there were handwritten notes in the margins, questions Zora had written including, where did $2.3 million go? And why are there transfers to TW Private Holdings? This proves she knew, Elaine said triumphantly. She confronted him with evidence of his theft, and he tried to silence her permanently. We need to get this to a judge who isn't in Whitman's pocket, Haywood decided. And we need to talk to Zora if she wakes up. When she wakes up, Meredith corrected firmly. At that moment, Haywood's phone rang. It was Lynn Patel from the hospital. Detective Zora Whitman regained consciousness briefly last night, she said quietly, as if afraid of being overheard. She asked for help. I think she's afraid. Did she say anything specific about what happened? No, but there's something else you should know. This isn't the first time she's been admitted with suspicious injuries. I treated her 6 months ago for what was reported as a fall downstairs, but the bruising pattern wasn't consistent with that explanation. Can you document that? Haywood asked. I already have. I kept my own notes separate from the official record because something felt off. I can provide those to you, but I'm concerned about my position here if Mr. Whitman finds out. Your name will be protected, Haywood promised. Can you call me immediately when she's conscious again? I'll try, but there's always someone from Whitman's security team watching her room. They monitor who goes in and out. After the call ended, Haywood updated the others. We need to get to Zora before Whitman realizes she's waking up. If she confirms what happened, combined with the financial evidence and the traffic camera footage, we might have enough to convince a judge. But how do we get past Whitman's security? Elaine asked. Lisa smiled. Leave that to me. I know someone in hospital administration who can help. Meanwhile, Thomas Whitman was growing increasingly concerned. His sources had informed him that Haywood was still investigating despite being officially removed from the case. The teacher and paralegal had disappeared, presumably into protective custody. And now his head of security reported that someone had been searching the area below the bridge. He called Richard Brooks again. I think it's time to accelerate our plans. What are you suggesting? Brooks asked cautiously. Zora needs to be moved to a private facility, for her own good, of course. Somewhere quiet where she can recover without the stress of police questions. That might look suspicious if done too quickly, Brooks warned. Then we need a medical reason, Thomas replied coldly. Make it happen, Richard. I'm not asking. Back at the hospital, Lynn Patel was starting her evening shift when she noticed increased activity around Zora's room. A new doctor she didn't recognize was reviewing her chart, and 2 more security guards had been posted. She overheard fragments of conversation. Transfer papers, and private facility, and tonight. Lynn slipped away to call Haywood, but as she reached for her phone, a hand gripped her arm. "Nurse Patel," Thomas Whitman said with a cold smile. "I'd like a word about my daughter's care." Her heart pounding, Lynn followed him to an empty consultation room. "My security team has been monitoring communications," Thomas said without preamble. "Your recent call to Detective Haywood was concerning." Lynn tried to maintain her composure. "I'm required to report suspicious injuries." "My daughter attempted suicide," Thomas said, his voice hardening. "Any suggestion otherwise is not only false but potentially damaging to her recovery. I'd hate to see a dedicated nurse like yourself lose her license over false accusations." The threat was clear. "Is that all, Mr. Whitman?" Lynn asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "For now. But remember, Port Haven Memorial relies heavily on donations from people like me. People who appreciate discretion." After he left, Lynn immediately texted Haywood, "They're moving her tonight, hurry." Haywood assembled his team quickly. With Lisa's contact in hospital administration, they secured temporary ID badges that would get them past the main security desk. The plan was simple, but risky. Lisa would create a distraction while Haywood and Meredith reached Zora's room. Elaine would wait in the car with the engine running. As they approached the hospital, Haywood received another text from Lynn. "Transfer ambulance arriving in 30 minutes. 4th floor, East Wing. We need to hurry," he told the others. They split up upon entering. Lisa headed to the security office to report a suspicious person in the parking garage, while Haywood and Meredith took the service elevator to the 4th floor. The corridor leading to Zora's room was empty except for one security guard. Whitman's private security had been temporarily called away to help with the transfer preparations. Haywood approached confidently, flashing his badge. "Detective Haywood, Port Haven PD. I need to speak with the patient." The guard looked uncertain. Mr. Whitman left strict instructions. "This is an active investigation," Haywood interrupted firmly. "Obstruction of justice is a serious offense." After a moment's hesitation, the guard stepped aside. 5 minutes. That's all I can give you before the transfer team arrives." Inside the room, Zora lay pale against the white sheets, tubes and wires connecting her to various machines. Her eyes were closed, but they fluttered open when Meredith gently said her name. "Zora? Do you remember me from the bridge?" Recognition dawned in the girl's eyes, followed by fear. "He's going to come back," she whispered. "We're here to help you," Haywood said, moving closer. "But we need you to tell us what happened that night. Did your father push you off the bridge?" Zora's eyes filled with tears. "I found the papers about my mother's trust fund. He's been stealing from it for years. When I confronted him, he said no one would ever believe me over him." "We found the documents by the river," Meredith told her, "and we have financial records proving the theft. He said he'd rather see me dead than give up the money," Zora continued, her voice growing stronger. "Then he grabbed me and forced me toward the railing. I fought him, but he was too strong." Haywood recorded her statement on his phone. "Zora, they're planning to move you to a private facility tonight. Somewhere we might not be able to reach you." Fear flashed across her face. "He'll kill me there. Please don't let them take me." "We won't," Meredith promised, squeezing her hand. "We're going to get you somewhere safe." Suddenly, the door opened. They expected the security guard, but instead, Thomas Whitman stood there, his face contorted with rage when he saw them. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "Detective, you have no authority here. You were removed from this case." "We have evidence, Thomas," Haywood said calmly. "Financial records, the documents from the river, traffic camera footage placing you at the bridge, and now Zora's statement." For a moment, Thomas's composure cracked, revealing the cold calculation beneath. Then he smiled, an expression more threatening than reassuring. "Evidence that will never see the light of day," he said softly. "Do you really think you can win against me in this town? I own half the judges and most of the police department." "Not all of us," Haywood replied, continuing to record. "And not the FBI, who are very interested in your offshore accounts and the tax evasion they represent." Thomas's smile faltered. You're bluffing. The federal prosecutor received copies of all our evidence this morning, Meredith added, though this was a lie they had quickly concocted. Even if you silence us, it's too late. For the first time, uncertainty crossed Thomas's face. Before he could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the hospital, the distraction Lisa had arranged by triggering a non-emergency fire alarm. In the confusion, Haywood moved quickly, stepping between Thomas and Zora's bed. "Mr. Whitman, you're under arrest for attempted murder and financial fraud." Thomas lunged forward, but Haywood was ready, subduing him with practiced efficiency. As he handcuffed the struggling man, Meredith helped Zora into a wheelchair. "Need to move now," Haywood said, his voice urgent. "His security team will be here any minute." As they hurried toward the service elevator, they could hear shouting behind them. The private security guards had realized something was wrong, but thanks to Lisa's distraction and their careful planning, they reached the parking garage where Elaine waited with the car. "Is she okay?" Elaine asked as they helped Zora into the back seat. "I am now," Zora said, a faint smile crossing her face for the first time. As they drove away from the hospital, Haywood made a call to the one judge in Port Haven he knew couldn't be bought, Judge Helen Martinez, known for her strict ethical standards and independence from the city's power. "Players. Judge Martinez, this is Detective Haywood. I need an emergency protection order and arrest warrant. It's about Thomas Whitman." "Yes, that Thomas Whitman. And ma'am, we're going to need federal involvement. This goes deeper than we thought." In the back seat, Meredith held Zora's hand as the girl watched the hospital recede in the distance. "It's over now," Meredith told her gently. "He can't hurt you anymore." But they all knew it wasn't truly over. Thomas Whitman would use every resource at his disposal to fight back. His connections, his money, his influence, all would be deployed against them. The real battle was just beginning. The courtroom fell silent as Zora Whitman took the stand. 3 months had passed since that rainy night on Eastwood Bridge, and much had changed. She walked with a slight limp now, a permanent reminder of her father's betrayal. But her eyes held a strength that hadn't been there before. From his seat at the defense table, Thomas Whitman stared at his daughter with cold eyes. His expensive suit couldn't hide how the past months had worn on him. After being denied bail due to flight risk concerns, he had spent weeks in county jail before his lawyers arranged for house arrest during the trial. "Please state your name for the record," the prosecutor, Diane Reynolds, said gently. "Zora Amara Whitman," she replied, her voice clear and steady. "And can you tell the court your relationship to the defendant?" Zora looked directly at Thomas. "He is my biological father, though he never wanted anyone to know that." Thomas's lawyer, Richard Brooks, objected immediately. "Your Honor, speculation about my client's feelings is inadmissible." "Sustained," Judge Martinez said. "The witness will stick to facts, not interpretations of the defendant's thoughts." Diane nodded. "Zora, please tell us about the night of April 15th in your own words." Zora took a deep breath. "I had found financial documents in my father's office showing he had been taking money from my trust fund for years. The trust was set up by my mother's parents after she died giving birth to me. And what did you do with this information?" "I confronted him that night. I asked him why he was stealing money that was meant for me." Zora's voice wavered slightly. "He became angry. He said no one would believe me over him, that he'd make sure I was locked away in a mental institution if I told anyone." "What happened next?" "He told me to get in the car. He drove to Eastwood Bridge. I thought he was just trying to scare me, but when we got there, he dragged me out and—" Zora paused, gathering her strength. "He said he'd rather see me dead than give up the money. Then he pushed me over the railing." In the gallery, Meredith Wilson wiped away tears. Beside her sat Elaine Corday and Detective Haywood, who had risked their careers to pursue this case. Near them was Lynn Patel, the nurse whose testimony about Zora's previous injuries had helped establish a pattern of abuse. The path to this day had not been easy. Thomas Whitman had used every resource at his disposal to fight the charges. Police Chief Palmer had been forced to recuse himself after evidence emerged of his financial ties to Whitman's companies. Several officers loyal to Palmer had attempted to discredit Haywood's investigation, but the evidence was too strong to ignore. The financial records Elaine had preserved proved systematic theft. The trust fund documents recovered from the riverbank showed Zora's discovery of the fraud. Traffic camera footage placed Thomas at the bridge at the exact time Meredith witnessed the attack. And most damning of all, Thomas had been recorded threatening Haywood and Meredith in Zora's hospital room, admitting he owned half the judges in town. That recording had gone viral after being leaked to the press, turning public opinion firmly against Thomas. Protesters had gathered outside his mansion daily, holding signs demanding justice for Zora. On the stand, Zora continued her testimony, describing how she had been kept isolated and controlled throughout her childhood, how Thomas had never acknowledged her publicly as his daughter, how she had discovered that her mother, Amira Johnson, had been planning to leave Thomas before her death. "The trust fund was my grandparents' way of making sure I would be taken care of," Zora explained. "They didn't trust Thomas, but they died in a car accident when I was 3, so there was no one left to protect me or check on the trust." During cross-examination, Brooks tried to paint Zora as mentally unstable and attention-seeking. "Isn't it true that you've been treated for depression? That you've had suicidal thoughts before?" "No," Zora said firmly. "Those medical records were fabricated. Dr. Reynolds has already admitted he was paid to create false records. Indeed, the therapist Thomas had claimed treated Zora had confessed to creating backdated records in exchange for a large payment. He was now facing charges of his own." "No further questions," Brooks said, returning to his seat with a defeated expression. As Zora stepped down from the witness stand, her eyes met Meredith's. The teacher gave her an encouraging nod. Over the past months, Meredith had become something of a surrogate mother to Zora, offering her a place to stay after she was released from the hospital. Next to testify was Meredith herself, describing in detail what she had witnessed on the bridge that night. Despite Brooks's attempts to question her reliability as a witness, her account remained consistent and compelling. "I know what I saw," she said firmly. "Thomas Whitman tried to kill his daughter that night. If I hadn't been driving by at that exact moment, he would have succeeded." The prosecution called several more witnesses. Elaine presented the financial evidence showing years of systematic theft from Zora's trust. Detective Haywood explained how the investigation had been obstructed at every turn by those loyal to Whitman. Lynn Patel testified about Zora's previous suspicious injuries and the attempts to move her from the hospital before she could speak to police. Finally, they played the recording from Zora's hospital room, where Thomas had openly threatened Haywood and Meredith, admitting to his influence over local officials. The jury listened intently as Thomas's voice filled the courtroom. "Evidence that will never see the light of day. Do you really think you can win against me in this town? I own half the judges and most of the police department." Thomas visibly flinched at hearing his own words. His lawyers had fought hard to keep that recording out of evidence, but Judge Martinez had ruled it admissible. When the prosecution rested their case, the defense presented their side, claiming Zora had attempted suicide and was now seeking revenge against a father who had only tried to protect her. They brought character witnesses who spoke of Thomas's charitable donations and business accomplishments. But these witnesses crumbled under cross-examination when asked if they had ever met or even heard of Zora before the incident. After 7 days of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for just 4 hours before reaching a verdict. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Thomas Whitman, guilty. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Zora closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. Not of sadness, but relief. On the charge of grand theft, we find the defendant guilty. Thomas sat stone-faced, his empire crumbling around him. On the charge of child abuse, we find the defendant guilty. Meredith squeezed Zora's hand as the remaining charges were read, each ending with the same word, guilty. 2 weeks later, Thomas Whitman was sentenced to 30 years in prison. His financial crimes had attracted federal attention, leading to additional charges of tax evasion and money laundering. His carefully constructed world of privilege and power had collapsed entirely. For Zora, the end of the trial marked a new beginning. With her trust fund restored and additional damages awarded by the court, she had the resources to build the life she wanted. She moved in with Meredith permanently, finding in her the supportive parent she had never had. On a bright autumn afternoon, 6 months after the bridge incident, Zora stood in the auditorium of Port Haven Community College, addressing a room full of people. "When my father pushed me off that bridge, he thought he was silencing me forever," she said. "He never imagined that his actions would give me a voice stronger than I ever had before." She had established the Amara Johnson Foundation, named after her mother, dedicated to helping victims of family violence and financial abuse. The foundation provided legal assistance, safe housing, and educational opportunities to those escaping abusive situations. "Today, we're announcing our first 10 scholarship recipients," Zora continued. "Young people who have overcome tremendous obstacles and are now pursuing their dreams." In the audience, Meredith watched proudly. Beside her sat Elaine, who had left Brooks and Morgan to work as the foundation's legal advisor. Detective Haywood, recently promoted after the police department's leadership shakeup, was there with his partner Lisa. Lynn Patel had come straight from her hospital shift, still wearing her scrubs. These people, once strangers, had become Zora's chosen family, bound together by their pursuit of justice against a powerful man who thought he was above the law. After the ceremony, they gathered at Meredith's house for dinner. As they shared stories and laughter around the table, Zora looked at each of them in turn. "I never thought I would say this," she said quietly. "But in a strange way, I'm grateful for what happened that night on the bridge. Not for what he did, but for how it brought all of you into my life." Meredith raised her glass. "To found family," she said, "and to the strength we never know we have until we're tested." Elaine smiled. "And to the truth that eventually comes to light no matter how hard someone tries to bury it. To justice," Haywood added, "even when it seems impossible. To healing," Lynn offered, "and new beginnings." Zora lifted her own glass, looking around at the circle of faces that had changed her life. "To all of you," she said simply, "my heroes." Outside, the sun was setting over Port Haven, casting long shadows across the city. In his prison cell, Thomas Whitman sat alone, his wealth and power stripped away. The empire he had built through deception and cruelty was being dismantled piece by piece, his assets liquidated to pay restitution to those he had wronged. Meanwhile, his daughter, the child he had tried to erase, then tried to kill, was flourishing in the light of truth and justice. The story of the rich white man who cast his black daughter off a bridge and the white woman who exposed everything had become more than a local scandal. It had sparked conversations about privilege, power, and accountability across the country. For Zora, the physical scars would always remain, reminders of what she had survived. But with each passing day, the emotional wounds began to heal, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging she had never known before. As night fell on their impromptu celebration, Zora stepped outside onto Meredith's porch, looking up at the stars. For the first time in her life, she felt truly free, not just from her father's control, but from the fear and isolation that had defined her existence for so long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, another therapy session, more foundation, work, college applications to complete. But tonight, surrounded by people who had risked everything to save her life and bring her justice, Zora Whitman finally felt something she had never expected to feel. She felt home.